She was 28 years old, a billionaire heiress, and the most envied woman in Manhattan. The engagement gala was supposed to be the most beautiful night of her life. Instead, hidden behind a private corridor while 500 guests raised champagne glasses in her honor, Charlotte Whitmore heard the man she loved describe exactly how he planned to destroy her. Not with anger, not with cruelty, with the calm, practiced voice of a man who had been planning this for years. She stopped breathing. She stopped moving. And in that single moment, everything she believed about her life collapsed into silence. Like and comment your city below. Let's see how far this story travels. The dress cost $40,000. Charlotte knew that because her assistant, Maya, had mentioned it 3 times in the past week with the particular reverence people reserve for things they consider sacred. Vera Wang. Hand-stitched. Flown in from Paris. Maya had said the words like they were supposed to mean something, and Charlotte had smiled the way she always smiled when people expected her to be impressed by the price of things. Warmly, automatically, with nothing real behind it. Now she stood in front of the floor-length mirror in the private suite on the 32nd floor of the Ashford Grand Hotel, and she thought the dress was beautiful in the way that expensive things are always beautiful, cold, precise, and completely indifferent to the person wearing it. She looked like a photograph of herself. Her dark hair was pinned up with a single strand falling loose near her left ear. Intentional, the stylist had assured her, though it felt like an accident. Her eyes were the pale gray that her father had always called her mother's eyes, and tonight, with the soft light of the vanity lamps catching them at this angle, they looked almost silver, almost like she wasn't tired, almost like she hadn't spent the past 3 nights lying awake running numbers in her head, quarterly projections, acquisition timelines, board meeting agendas, the way she always did when she was trying to avoid thinking about something she didn't want to examine too closely. She pressed 2 fingers to her collarbone and breathed. Downstairs, 500 people were waiting. The engagement gala for Charlotte Whitmore and Nathan Caldwell had been covered in every major publication from the Times to Vogue to 3 separate financial magazines that had somehow decided a billionaire heiress getting engaged was relevant to their readership. The guest list included 2 senators, the mayor, 7 Fortune 500 CEOs, and more old money than Charlotte had encountered in a single room since her father's 65th birthday party 2 years ago. The flowers alone had cost more than most people's annual salary. Maya had mentioned that too. Charlotte reached for her champagne glass and found it empty. She didn't remember finishing it. There was a knock at the door. 3 short, precise knocks that meant it was James, her head of personal security, rather than Maya, who knocked twice and then immediately opened the door anyway. 5 minutes, Ms. Whitmore. Thank you, James. She set the empty glass down on the vanity table and looked at herself one more time. Something was sitting in her chest that she couldn't name. Not nerves exactly, not excitement, something heavier than both, something that had been settling there quietly for weeks like sediment at the bottom of still water, and she had been carefully, deliberately not disturbing it. She was marrying Nathan Caldwell in 6 weeks. That was a fact. That was the plan. The invitations had gone out. The venue was booked. The Whitmore family estate in Connecticut, converted for the occasion into something the event coordinator called a vision. Her father had already made 3 speeches at 3 separate board meetings about the future of the Whitmore legacy and the importance of building strong partnerships, which was Richard Whitmore's way of expressing something he would never say directly. He approved. Richard Whitmore approved of very few things in Charlotte's personal life, which meant his approval of Nathan was either the best possible sign or the one she should have looked at more carefully. She picked up her clutch, smoothed the front of the $40,000 dress, and went downstairs to her engagement party. The ballroom of the Ashford Grand was the kind of space that had been designed specifically to make human beings feel small and elegant simultaneously, with ceilings that soared 40 feet above the marble floor and 3 enormous chandeliers that cast everything in amber and gold. Someone had arranged white orchids along every surface, tables, window ledges, the curved edge of the bar, and the cumulative effect was extravagant in a way that Charlotte recognized as Nathan's taste rather than her own. Nathan liked spectacle. He moved through it now with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire adult life in rooms exactly like this one. She watched him from the entrance for a moment before he saw her. Tall, dark-suited, his jaw set at the particular angle that made him look distinguished rather than severe. He was laughing at something the mayor had said, his hand on the man's shoulder, and his laugh was warm and complete and reached his eyes in a way that Charlotte had always found disarming. He was 34 years old and had built Caldwell Capital from a mid-sized investment firm into one of the most respected financial institutions on the Eastern Seaboard. He was the kind of man that other men described as self-made, which was technically accurate if you didn't count the inherited connections and the prep school network and the kind of quiet privilege that opens doors before you even raise your hand to knock. Charlotte had made her peace with that a long time ago. She had grown up inside the same system and understood it the way you understand the particular weight of the air in the house you were raised in. Nathan turned and saw her. His face changed, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone else would have noticed, but Charlotte noticed. She had spent 18 months learning the geography of his expressions, and she recognized this one, genuine warmth, pride, something that looked very much like love. He crossed the room toward her, and when he took both her hands in his and looked at her, she felt some of the unnamed heaviness in her chest shift sideways. "You look extraordinary," he said. "You say that every time." "Because it's true every time." He leaned in and kissed her cheek near her ear, and his voice dropped low. "Let's get through the speeches quickly. I want this night to be ours." She squeezed his hands. They moved into the room together, and the crowd shifted around them like a tide adjusting to the presence of something new. And for the next 90 minutes, Charlotte shook hands and accepted congratulations and laughed at things that were mildly funny and smiled at people she had known for years and a handful she had never met, but whose names she recognized from her father's contact list. Richard Whitmore himself was stationed near the bar with the particular immovability of a man at the center of his own domain, tall and silver-haired and radiating the specific kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. He raised his glass when Charlotte passed. She raised hers back. Nathan was beside her for most of it, and then wasn't. Absorbed into a cluster of men near the far end of the room, Caldwell Capital Associates mixed with a few faces Charlotte didn't immediately place. She watched him for a moment from across the ballroom and then turned her attention back to Eleanor Hargrove, the 70-year-old matriarch of the Hargrove shipping family, who was explaining in great detail what she considered the fundamental error of modern floral arrangements. Charlotte listened attentively. Eleanor Hargrove had been a friend of Charlotte's mother and was the only person at this party who had asked Charlotte, privately and without any particular agenda, whether she was genuinely happy. Charlotte had said yes. She had meant it at the time. Awesome. It was just after 9 o'clock when Charlotte slipped away from the ballroom. She needed 3 minutes of silence the way other people need water. It was a fact about herself that she had accepted long ago, the introvert's tax on public performance, and she had learned to find quiet corners in loud rooms the way a person learns any necessary skill. There was a private corridor behind the east wing of the ballroom level that she had scouted earlier in the afternoon, connecting the hotel's service area to a small anteroom used for private meetings, the kind of hallway that existed in grand hotels specifically so that the machinery of events could operate invisibly. She pushed through the door at the corridor's entrance and let it close behind her. The sound of the party became muffled, not gone, but reduced to a distant pressure, the particular hum of 500 people existing simultaneously in an enclosed space. Charlotte leaned against the wall, closed her eyes, and breathed. She counted to 10. Then she heard voices. They were coming from the anteroom at the far end of the corridor, and she might have ignored them. Private conversations happened at private events, and it was not in Charlotte's nature to eavesdrop, except that she recognized one of the voices. The cadence of it, the particular flatness that appeared in Nathan's voice when he was certain he was not being observed. She had heard it twice before. Once on the phone with someone she didn't know, late at night when he thought she was asleep. Once in a conversation with his business partner, Marcus Webb, when she walked into a room a few seconds before she was expected. Both times she had filed the sound away in the part of her mind that noticed things and didn't yet know what to do with them. She stood still in the corridor. The anteroom door was not fully closed. A gap of 3, maybe 4 inches. Enough. Nathan's voice came through clearly, and the flatness was there in full force, and what it was saying was this. 6 weeks. Once we're married, the asset transfer provisions kick in automatically. Whitmore's lawyers drafted the prenuptial to protect her, but there are 3 clauses in the amended contract she hasn't reviewed yet. I made certain of that. A second voice, unfamiliar, male, carrying the specific smoothness of someone accustomed to saying careful things in careful ways. And if she finds them before the ceremony, she won't. Nathan's voice was almost gentle. Charlotte is brilliant at the things she decides to pay attention to. She trusts me completely. That was the entire point. Charlotte did not move. Her hand was against the wall, and she was aware of the rough texture of the wallpaper under her palm with sudden, absolute clarity. "The board vote," the unfamiliar voice said, "will happen within 90 days of the wedding. I'll have enough proxies by then to force the restructure. Her father's legacy is actually quite simple once you understand its architecture. The man built an empire designed to be controlled by family. I just need to become family." "And the girl?" A pause. "Charlotte will be a Caldwell. She'll have every comfort she's ever had. Her name, her lifestyle. She's not going to be harmed." Another pause. Longer. "Unless she becomes difficult, in which case there are options we haven't needed to discuss yet. But I promise you, Harlan, she won't be difficult. She's not built for it." Charlotte stopped breathing. She stopped counting. She stood in the corridor of the Ashford Grand Hotel in a $40,000 dress with her engagement party in full performance 40 feet away, and she listened to the man she was supposed to marry explain in the patient, methodical voice of someone describing a business transaction exactly how he had spent 18 months arranging her life so that she would have no choice but to give him everything her family had ever built. The corridor was very cold. She didn't remember it being cold before. Her hand slid off the wallpaper. She made herself breathe, slowly, through her nose, counting again because it was the only thing she knew how to do in this moment that wouldn't end in her walking through that door and destroying the next 6 weeks of preparation in a single confrontation that she was not yet ready to have. She needed to think. She needed to be certain. She needed the evidence before she moved because she had watched her father handle enough crises to understand that emotion, without strategy, is just noise. She walked back down the corridor. Her heels made no sound on the carpet. She pushed through the door at the far end and stepped back into the hallway, adjacent to the ballroom, and stood there for exactly 4 seconds before Maya appeared around the corner with the expression of a woman who has been looking for someone and is relieved to have found them. "Charlotte, they're about to do the toast." "I know." Charlotte's voice was her working voice, steady, clear, absolutely controlled. "I stepped out for a moment. I'm ready." Maya's expression flickered with something. Concern, maybe, or the beginning of a question. And then Charlotte was already moving past her toward the ballroom entrance, and Maya was falling into step behind her, and the doors were opening, and the sound of 500 people hit Charlotte like a physical force, and she walked into it and smiled. Nathan was already at the center of the room, champagne glass in hand, waiting for her. She crossed to him. He put his arm around her waist. She looked up at him and let the smile stay exactly where it was. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the apartment on the 38th floor of the Whitmore Tower. Her apartment. The one she had lived in since she was 23 and had insisted on owning rather than renting because her father's lesson had always been that you never paid for something you could possess. And she stared at the ceiling and let the thing she had heard arrange itself in her mind with the cold precision she usually applied to quarterly earnings. Nathan had said, "The amended contract she hasn't reviewed yet." She had signed a prenuptial agreement. Her lawyers had reviewed it. 3 separate attorneys from Whitmore Legal. Her team, her choices, her people. She had read the document herself, which was not something everyone did, and was one of the reasons that Charlotte, for all the ways the world tried to reduce her to her name and her face and her inherited wealth, was genuinely formidable. She had read it. She had not found 3 undisclosed clauses, which meant either she had missed something, possible, if the language was sufficiently buried, or the document had been altered after the review process, which was a different kind of problem entirely. She got up at 4 in the morning and went to her home office. The prenuptial agreement was in the fireproof safe behind the bookshelf in the northeast corner. She had the combination memorized. She pulled the document out and spread it on her desk under the lamp and began to read. She read for 2 hours. She found nothing, which meant the amended version Nathan had referenced existed somewhere else. A second draft. A version that had been prepared without her knowledge, that was waiting somewhere in the mechanics of their approaching wedding, planted where it would be presented at a moment when signatures were expected, and the ceremony itself created enough social pressure to discourage careful reading. She sat in the pool of lamplight in her home office at 6 in the morning and thought about the word difficult. Unless she becomes difficult. She picked up her phone and called her attorney. Not the Whitmore legal team, not anyone who had any prior connection to the prenuptial process. A single number she kept in her contacts under the name Margaret H. for Margaret Holloway, who had been her mother's personal attorney and who was 71 years old and had spent 40 years in corporate law and family litigation, and whom Charlotte trusted with a completeness she extended to approximately 4 people on the planet. The phone rang twice. Charlotte. Margaret's voice was alert in the way of people who have spent decades waking up to emergencies. It's 6 in the morning. I know. I need to meet with you today, not at your office, somewhere private. A pause. How serious? Charlotte looked at the prenuptial agreement spread across her desk. I need a forensic accountant and a contract specialist. I need them by this afternoon, and I need everything we discussed to stay between us. Another pause. When Margaret spoke again, her voice had shifted into the register that Charlotte associated with absolute professional gravity. I'll make some calls. Where do you want to meet? They met at Margaret's apartment on the Upper East Side at noon. Charlotte, Margaret, a forensic accountant named David Park, who Margaret had worked with for 15 years, and a contracts attorney named Susan Cho, who specialized in corporate fraud and had spent 8 years as a federal prosecutor. Charlotte had told no one she was going. She had told Maya she was resting. She had left her phone in the apartment and borrowed one of Maya's personal devices to send the address to Margaret. She was not certain this level of caution was necessary. She was not willing to assume it wasn't. She told them everything she had heard in the corridor. She told them precisely, without embellishment, in the same way she gave presentations to her board, chronologically, with the specific language she remembered, and a clear notation of what was inference versus what was direct quotation. She told them about the 3 undisclosed clauses, about the proxy votes, about the 90-day timeline. She told them about the name Harlan. Susan Cho wrote everything down. David Park asked 3 questions, all financial, each one more specific than the last. Margaret listened with the particular stillness of someone who has spent a lifetime hearing terrible things and has learned to receive them without showing what they cost her. When Charlotte finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Margaret said, Do you have access to the full contracts archive from the engagement period? Everything Caldwell's team submitted? Yes. I want it all. Every document, every addendum, every communication that passed through Whitmore Legal in connection with the marriage agreements. Margaret's voice was precise and entirely without warmth, which was how Charlotte knew she was genuinely alarmed. David, I want you to pull every public record on Caldwell Capital that you can access by tomorrow morning. Business filings, SEC disclosures, anything that touches the corporate structure. David nodded. There's something else, Charlotte said. They looked at her. He mentioned options. When he said I might become difficult, he said there were options they hadn't needed to discuss yet. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. I want to know what those options are before he does. Susan Cho looked up from her notepad. Charlotte, if what you heard is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt that it is, you're not looking at a simple financial fraud situation. The language you're describing suggests premeditated conspiracy to defraud, potentially wire fraud, and depending on what the options he referenced actually are, it could go considerably further. I know. You need to be careful about how you move forward. If he realizes you know, he won't. Charlotte's voice was flat and completely steady. He told his associate, I'm not built to be difficult. I'm going to let him keep believing that for exactly as long as it takes to build a case that will leave him no options of his own. Margaret was looking at her with an expression Charlotte couldn't quite read. Something between admiration and worry, pressed together into a single look. And the wedding? Margaret asked. Charlotte thought about Nathan's face across the ballroom, the warm, complete laugh, the arm around her waist, 18 months of careful, patient architecture. I'll cancel it, she said, but not yet, and not in a way that tells him I know. When I cancel this wedding, I want him exposed. I want everything he's built to come apart at the same moment he loses me. She stood up and smoothed the front of her coat. Get me the information. I'll handle the rest. She spent the next 2 weeks performing her life with the precision of a woman who had been trained since childhood to present one face to the world while operating entirely from another. She attended 3 joint appearances with Nathan. She met with the wedding coordinator twice. She responded to the flood of congratulatory messages from people she'd known her whole life with the warmth that was expected of her. Nathan noticed nothing. Or if he did, he said nothing, and Charlotte was beginning to understand that Nathan Caldwell was also a person who had spent years saying nothing when it served him. Meanwhile, David Park found the shell companies. 3 of them nested inside what appeared to be legitimate investment vehicles, each one connected to Caldwell Capital through a series of holding structures that had been deliberately constructed to be difficult to trace. The financial patterns were not illegal on their surface, but the timing was specific. Each shell company had been formed in the 12 months following the beginning of Nathan and Charlotte's relationship. Each one had been capitalized at precisely the moment of a significant milestone in their relationship. The 6-month mark, the first public appearance together, the introduction to Richard Whitmore. The architecture wasn't speculation, it was a plan. Susan Cho found the second prenuptial document 3 days later, buried in a data room that had been assembled for what Nathan's legal team described as estate planning purposes, accessible to Charlotte in principle, never drawn to her attention in practice. The 3 clauses were exactly where Nathan had said they were, worded with the particular elegance of legal language designed to mean everything and sound like nothing. Asset transfer provisions, operational control mechanisms, a spousal authority clause that, in plain language, would have given Nathan Caldwell the ability to make binding financial decisions on Charlotte's behalf within the structure of the Whitmore companies within 60 days of their marriage. Charlotte read it in Margaret's apartment on a Tuesday afternoon. She read it once, completely, with the same cold focus she had brought to every difficult thing in her professional life. Then she looked at Margaret and said, "He planned to take my father's company." "Yes, while I was still alive. He was going to take it while I was his wife and I was still sitting in the room." The words were entirely without expression. "He wasn't planning to disappear with the money. He was going to stand next to me in boardrooms and make decisions in my name, and I was going to be, Charlotte, I was going to be the face on something he owned." "Yes," Margaret said again, quietly. "That appears to be the plan." Charlotte put the document down. She sat with it for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and called her wedding coordinator. "Renata," she said when the woman answered, "I need to cancel the ceremony, all of it. Venue, catering, flowers, everything." She kept her voice completely level. "Personal decision, non-negotiable. I'll cover all cancellation costs." Renata asked 3 questions. Charlotte answered 2 of them. The third one, "Are you all right?" She let sit for a moment and then said, "Yes, I just need this to stop." She ended the call. Within 4 hours, the story was everywhere. Charlotte Whitmore had canceled her wedding to Nathan Caldwell 6 weeks before the ceremony. No explanation, no statement, no public appearance. The media called her a runaway bride. The speculation was immediate, loud, and entirely disconnected from the truth. Nathan's people issued a statement expressing surprise and requesting privacy. Nathan himself sent Charlotte a text message that read, "We need to talk, please." She didn't respond. She was sitting in her home office with David Park's financial analysis spread across her desk, and Susan Cho's legal brief open on her laptop, and Margaret's voice in her ear saying, quietly, that the federal contacts Susan had maintained from her time as a prosecutor might be worth a conversation. Charlotte was thinking about what Nathan had said in the corridor. "She's not built for it." She picked up her pen and made a note in the margin of Susan's brief. Across the city, in the apartment Nathan kept on the Upper West Side, she imagined him reading the canceled invoices and the media alerts, and beginning to understand, slowly, with the first cold touch of genuine concern, that something had shifted outside the architecture of his plan. She hoped he was afraid. She hoped the fear arrived the way hers had, in a cold corridor with no warning and no time to prepare. She went back to the documents, and somewhere in the city, a man Charlotte Whitmore had not thought about in years saw her photograph on a news alert on his phone, read the headline about the canceled wedding, and went very still. Damian Rossi had known Charlotte in university. They had never been close. She had been brilliant and focused and slightly untouchable, and he had been, even then, something that didn't translate well into her world. But he had noticed her. He had noticed her the way you notice a person whose interior life is operating at a frequency slightly different from the people around them, and you recognize it because it matches something in yourself. He had watched her face in the news photograph for a long time. Then he had put his phone in his pocket and told the man seated across from him that the meeting was going to have to wait, because something was wrong. He didn't know yet what it was. But Damian Rossi had survived the world he now controlled by learning to trust exactly this sensation, the quiet, certain knowledge that underneath the surface of something, in the machinery where the truth was actually moving, something had gone very badly off course. He made one call. Then he got in his car. Charlotte was at the Whitmore estate in Connecticut when James appeared at the door of the library and told her there was someone at the gate. "He says his name is Damian Rossi," James said. "He says you know him." Charlotte looked up from the documents. The name arrived with the particular resonance of something you haven't thought about in years but recognize immediately when it appears, like a song from a time in your life that belonged to a different version of yourself. "How did he find me here?" James's expression was careful. "He didn't say. He asked me to tell you he's not here about the news. He said—" James paused. "He said he has one question." Charlotte looked at the library door. Through the window, the evening had gone blue and cold, and the estate grounds stretched out in the early dark, with the particular stillness of a place that had absorbed generations of her family's history and held it quietly in the walls. She thought about Nathan's voice in the corridor. She thought about the documents on the desk in front of her. She thought about the word options. "Let him in," she said. She was still sitting at the library desk when Damian Rossi walked through the door, and she registered immediately that the 10 years since she had last seen him had not softened whatever it was that had always set him at a slight remove from the world around him. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe she had simply forgotten. His face was the same, sharp-featured, watchful, carrying the specific stillness of someone who had learned that controlled attention is a form of power. But the version of that face in front of her now had been worn in by something she didn't have a name for yet. He stopped a few feet inside the door. He looked at her, not at the documents on the desk, not at the evidence of the last 2 weeks written into the organized chaos of her workspace, just at her face directly, the way very few people ever actually looked at Charlotte Whitmore because most people were too focused on what she represented to see what she was. "Who hurt you?" he said. Not, "I saw the news." Not, "I heard about the engagement." Not, "Are you okay?" which was the question everyone else had asked, and which Charlotte had answered 20 times in 2 weeks with the same careful nothing, just that. She felt something shift in her chest, the unnamed heaviness moving again, except this time it didn't slide sideways. It cracked. She looked at Damian Rossi across the library of the house where she had grown up, and she made a decision that she did not examine and did not second-guess, because the rational part of her mind was occupied with the documents and the shell companies and the federal contacts, and the part of her that was left was very tired and had been alone with the truth for 2 weeks, and had run out of the particular energy it takes to keep secrets from someone who already knows something is wrong. "Sit down," she said. She told him everything. And when she finished, Damian was quiet for a long moment, looking at the desk, at the documents she had assembled, at the shape of what Nathan Caldwell had built and what it had been aimed at. Then he looked at her. "I want you to know something," he said. His voice was very quiet, completely level. "I'm going to find out what the options were, the ones he said he hadn't needed to discuss yet." Charlotte held his gaze. "And then?" she said. Damian's expression didn't change. "And then Nathan Caldwell is going to understand what it means to build something aimed at the wrong person." Outside, the estate went dark. Inside the library, Charlotte Whitmore looked at the man across from her. This man from a world she had only ever observed at a distance. This man who had walked through her gate and asked the one question nobody else had asked, and felt, for the first time in 2 weeks, the cold and quiet certainty that she was not alone in this. She didn't know yet what Damian Rossi was. She didn't know yet what it would cost her to let him help. But Nathan Caldwell had told his associate she wasn't built for difficult. He was about to find out how wrong he was. Damian Rossi did not stay for dinner. He stayed for 4 hours. Charlotte learned more about the mechanics of how power actually moved in the world in those 4 hours than she had in 8 years of running a multi-billion-dollar company, and she had gone into that conversation believing she understood quite a lot. The experience was not humbling exactly. It was more specific than that. It was the sensation of standing in a room you thought you knew and discovering a door in a wall you had walked past 100 times. He didn't lecture. He didn't perform expertise. He asked questions, precise, sequential, each one building on her answer to the last. And as she responded, she watched him construct the shape of Nathan's operation in his mind, the way a surgeon reads an X-ray, calmly, without flinching, identifying the thing that was wrong with the practiced neutrality of someone who has seen worse. When she finished walking him through the shell companies, the amended prenuptial, the proxy vote timeline, Damien was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Who is Harlan?" "I don't know. I only heard the name once. Nathan used it in the corridor." "First name or last?" "I don't know." Damien took out his phone and typed something, put it back in his pocket. "I'll find out." "How?" He looked at her steadily. "That's not something you need to know tonight." Charlotte held the look for a moment. She was not accustomed to being told what she didn't need to know. She was not accustomed to sitting across from someone who said it without any aggression, simply as a statement of fact, as if the boundary were a natural feature of the landscape rather than a choice. She let it go. For now. "What I need from you," Damien said, "is everything Caldwell's team has touched in the last 2 years. Not just the prenuptial documents, business correspondence, meeting records, any communication that passed between his people and yours. My legal team is already pulling that." "I don't mean your legal team." His voice was even. "I mean the records that didn't go through official channels, the conversations that happened in rooms without assistance, the agreements that were made before the paperwork existed." He paused. "Nathan Caldwell didn't build what you're describing by keeping clean records. There's a layer underneath the documents. That's the layer I'm interested in." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. "You're talking about things that aren't legally obtainable." "I'm talking about the truth," Damien said. "How it's obtained is a separate conversation." She should have told him to leave. She knew that. The rational part of her mind. The part that had spent 2 weeks building a careful, legal, documented case with Margaret and Susan and David, was generating a clear and well-reasoned argument for why she should thank Damien Rossi for his concern and show him to the door and continue on the path she had already established. She thought about the word options. "All right," she said. He left at 11. Charlotte stood at the window of the library and watched the headlights of his car disappear down the estate driveway, and then she stood there for another minute in the dark, looking at the place where the lights had been. James appeared in the doorway behind her. "Should I run a background check?" Charlotte turned from the window. "On Damien Rossi?" "Yes. Don't bother. I already know what you'll find." She crossed back to the desk and began organizing the documents for the night. "And what you won't." James was quiet for a moment. "Ms. Whitmore, with respect, the man controls—" "I know what he controls, James." Her voice was not sharp. It was simply final. "Make sure the gate security logs are clean. I don't want tonight on any record that Nathan's people could access." James nodded and left without another word. Charlotte sat back down at the desk. She thought about the question Damien had asked her. Not the ones about Nathan, the financial questions, the legal questions, the structural questions she had answered with the precision she brought to all professional problems. The first one, the one he had walked through the door with. Who hurt you? Not what happened. Not are you okay? Not the version of the question that was really about the questioner's own discomfort with a situation they didn't understand. The direct one, the one that assumed damage and asked only about its source. She pulled up her laptop and opened a new encrypted file. She began to type. Nathan called at 7 the next morning. Charlotte was on her second coffee and her third hour of reviewing David Park's latest financial analysis when her phone buzzed on the desk with Nathan's name on the screen. She looked at it for the length of 2 full rings. Then she answered. "Charlotte." His voice was warm, careful. The specific warmth of a man who was not certain what he was walking into. "I've been worried about you." "I'm fine." "The cancellation was a personal decision." Her voice was steady and entirely empty of anything that could be read. "I'm sorry for the disruption to your schedule." A pause. She could hear him recalibrating. "I don't care about my schedule. I care about you. Can we meet? I just want to talk." "I don't think that's a good idea right now." Charlotte? Nathan. She kept her voice gentle. Not cold. Gentle was more useful, harder to push against. I need some time, that's all. Please give me that. Another pause. Longer. Of course, he said finally. And then, I love you. I need you to know that. She looked at David Park's analysis on the screen in front of her. The shell company formation dates, the capitalization timing, the 18 months of careful, patient architecture. I know, she said. She ended the call. She sat for a moment with the phone face down on the desk. Then she picked it up and called Margaret. The thing about Nathan Caldwell, Charlotte was learning, was that he was not a man who panicked. He was a man who adjusted. Within 72 hours of the wedding cancellation, 3 things happened in the business world that looked like coincidence and were not. A major institutional investor pulled a significant commitment from a Whitmore real estate fund, citing changed market conditions in language so vague it was legally meaningless. An executive vice president at Whitmore Media, a man who had been with the company for 11 years and whom Charlotte had personally mentored, submitted his resignation with 2 weeks' notice and an offer letter from a Caldwell Capital subsidiary already in hand. And a regulatory inquiry arrived at Whitmore Legal, ostensibly routine, targeting the company's acquisition process from 18 months ago, which was, Charlotte noted with precise cold clarity, the exact moment she had first started dating Nathan Caldwell. Margaret got the regulatory notice on a Thursday afternoon and called Charlotte within the hour. He moved fast, Margaret said. He was already prepared. Charlotte was standing at the window of the estate library again. She had been spending a great deal of time at that window. This wasn't reactive. He had contingencies. Charlotte, if he had contingencies for the engagement falling apart, he planned for every outcome. She turned away from the window, including me figuring it out. The silence on Margaret's end of the line carried weight. Then the options he mentioned are already in motion, Charlotte said. Some of them. The financial pressure first. He's making the companies bleed to demonstrate what he can do, to show me what refusing him costs. And if you don't respond? Charlotte thought about that. He escalates, she told Damien the next day. He came to the estate again, late afternoon, gray light through the windows, the grounds gone brown and bare in the November cold. Charlotte had the David Park analysis and the new regulatory notice spread across the library desk when he walked in, and she didn't bother with preamble. She laid it out. The investor withdrawal, the executive resignation, the regulatory inquiry, the timing. Damien listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at the regulatory notice for a long moment. The inquiry is theater, he said. It's designed to occupy your legal team and create a public record of uncertainty around the acquisition process. It won't produce anything actionable, but it doesn't need to. It just needs to make the financial markets nervous, which it's already doing. Yes. He straightened up from the desk. The investor withdrawal is real pressure. Who initiated it? David traced it to a fund management firm called Grayline Capital, based in Delaware. Third party on paper. Grayline Capital. Damien's expression didn't change. I know that name. Charlotte looked at him. Through what? Through the kind of work I do. He met her eyes directly. Grayline has managed assets for certain associates of mine in the past. They're a service organization. They do what they're paid to do. Who paid them this time? That, Damien said, is what I've been finding out. He reached into his jacket and placed a folded document on the desk. Harlan. His full name is Harlan Voss. He's a financial architect. That's the only way to describe what he does. He builds corporate structures for people who need their money to be somewhere it legally can't be. He's been associated with Caldwell Capital for 6 years, always at arm's length, never in any public filing. Charlotte unfolded the document. It was a financial profile, detailed, sourced from records she couldn't immediately identify, which meant they hadn't come from any database her own team had access to. She looked up at Damien. How did you get this? He held her gaze. Do you want to debate methodology, or do you want to understand what you're dealing with? She looked back at the document. Harlan Voss, 63 years old, former corporate attorney turned financial consultant. 3 civil suits in the past decade, all settled out of court with confidentiality agreements. Two former business partners who had both, separately, experienced significant financial reversals within 18 months of their professional separation from Voss. No criminal record, no regulatory sanctions. The specific cleanliness of a man who was very good at ensuring that consequences landed on other people. He's Nathan's cleaner, Charlotte said. He's more than that. He's the architect of the whole structure. The shell companies, the asset transfer provisions, the proxy vote strategy. The legal framework for all of it has Voss's fingerprints on it. Nathan is the face. Voss is the machinery. Charlotte set the document down carefully. If we expose Voss, you expose the whole structure, yes. Damien was watching her. But Voss is not easy to expose. He's been doing this for 20 years. He knows exactly how close to the legal line he can operate without crossing it. Then we find where he crossed it. We already have something. Damien reached into his jacket again and produced a second document, smaller, a single printed page. 6 years ago, before Voss's association with Caldwell became formalized, there was a company, medical technology firm in Boston. Legitimate business, small, built over 8 years by two brothers named Paris. Caldwell Capital approached them for an acquisition. The Paris brothers declined. 8 months later, the company collapsed under a regulatory investigation that turned out to be based on fabricated documentation. Charlotte read the page. And Voss was the attorney of record for the regulatory complaint, under a shell identity. The complaint was filed through a firm that dissolved 6 months after the investigation concluded. The room was quiet. Charlotte looked at the single page in her hands and understood exactly what it meant and exactly what it would take to prove it, and whether either of those things was currently possible. The Paris brothers, she said. Are they? One of them is. Damien's voice was level. The other died 2 years after the company collapsed. Heart attack. He was 44. A pause. The one who's still alive has been trying to interest someone in his brother's story for 6 years. Nobody with the resources to act on it has been willing to listen. Charlotte put the page down. She was quiet for a moment. Until now, she said. Until now, Damien agreed. She called Susan Cho that night. Susan listened to the Paris brothers' information with the focused silence of a former federal prosecutor receiving a tip she recognized as credible. When Charlotte finished, Susan said, "If what you're describing is accurate, and if the surviving brother will testify, the fabricated regulatory complaint connects Voss directly to a pattern of deliberate corporate destruction. That's a RICO predicate." Meaning? Meaning the entire structure, Voss, Caldwell, the shell companies, the asset transfer scheme, becomes part of a racketeering framework, which means federal jurisdiction, which means the SEC and the DOJ, not just civil courts. Charlotte was standing in the kitchen of the estate, the phone pressed to her ear, looking at nothing in particular. How long to build that case? With the surviving Paris brothers' cooperation and the financial documentation your team has already assembled? 3 months, minimum. More likely 6. Nathan won't wait 6 months. No, Susan said. He won't. The threatening messages started on a Monday. The first one came to Charlotte's personal email address. The private one. The one that was not listed anywhere. The one that only approximately 12 people in the world had. It arrived at 2 in the morning and contained 11 words. You should have said yes. This didn't have to be complicated. Charlotte read it at 6 a.m. when she woke up and checked her phone out of habit. She read it twice. Then she photographed the screen, forwarded it to Susan Cho with a single line, "Document this," and got up to make coffee. The second message came 3 days later to the same address. "You belong to me. That hasn't changed." The third came 2 days after that, and this one was different. No words, just an image. The gate of the Whitmore estate, photographed from outside at night. The timestamp on the image was from the previous evening. Charlotte showed it to James. James's expression went very still. "We need to expand the perimeter monitoring," he said. "Yes," Charlotte said. "We do." She paused. "And call the number I'm going to give you. Don't use any phone that's connected to the estate system." James looked at her. "His name is Damien Rossi," Charlotte said. "Tell him the situation has changed." Damien arrived within 2 hours. He looked at the 3 messages. He looked at the photograph of the gate. He looked at Charlotte with the particular expression she was beginning to recognize. Not alarm, because she suspected genuine alarm was not something Damian Rossi experienced in the way most people did, but a heightened attention, a recalibration of the internal calculation he was apparently always running. "He's telling you that he can reach you," Damian said. "I know what he's telling me. And he knows about this location, which means he's had you watched since before the cancellation. Probably since before the engagement." Damian was quiet for a moment. He set the phone down on the desk. "I'm going to put people on the perimeter, my people, in addition to your security, not replacing them." He looked at her. "That's not a request." Charlotte held his gaze for a moment. "All right. And you don't go anywhere alone, not until this is resolved." "Damian! Charlotte!" His voice was very quiet, and there was something in it that stopped her. Not a threat, not even pressure, just the specific weight of someone saying a true thing. "He sent you a photograph of your own gate to tell you that the distance between you and what he's planning is smaller than you think. I need you to take that seriously." She looked at him. She thought about the photograph, the gate in the dark, the timestamp. Someone standing outside the perimeter of the house where she had grown up, in the cold, taking a picture of the place she was sleeping and sending it to her phone. She thought about Nathan's voice, calm, methodical, describing options. "All right," she said again. Damian nodded once and took out his phone. Charlotte turned to the window. Outside, the estate grounds were gray and still. Bare trees, cold sky. The driveway stretching toward a gate that someone had stood outside of 2 nights ago with a camera. She was not afraid. She recognized that this was unusual and probably a liability and chose to consider it an asset instead. Fear was information, and she was receiving the information it was trying to give her. The situation was more dangerous than the document suggested. The distance was smaller than she had calculated. Nathan was not a man who accepted outcomes he hadn't chosen. What she felt, standing at that window, was something closer to clarity. The shape of it was fully visible now. Nathan, Voss, the shell companies, the financial pressure, the messages, the photograph. The escalating architecture of a man who had built a very specific plan and was not willing to let the failure of one element dismantle the whole. She thought about the Paris brothers. She thought about the one who had died at 44. She turned from the window. "I need to speak to Daniel Paris," she said, "the surviving brother. I need to meet with him directly." Damian looked up from his phone. "I can arrange that. Soon. Tomorrow, if you want." Charlotte nodded. She moved back to the desk and sat down and pulled the financial analysis toward her. "And Damian," she didn't look up from the page. "The options Nathan mentioned, the ones he hadn't needed to discuss yet." She traced a line of figures with one finger, not reading them, just keeping her hands occupied. "Do you know what they are?" The pause before he answered was brief, but she heard it. "Some of them," he said. She looked up. His expression was contained in the way that things are contained when the alternative requires a conversation neither person is ready to have yet. "Tell me," she said. He held her gaze for a long moment, and then his phone buzzed in his hand, and he looked at the screen and something shifted in his face, something that was not the controlled stillness she had come to associate with him, but its opposite. The stillness breaking into... The phone in Damian's hand was showing a photograph. He turned it so Charlotte could see. It was Margaret Holloway, 71 years old, Charlotte's mother's attorney, the woman Charlotte had called at 6 in the morning 2 weeks ago because she was one of 4 people on the planet she trusted completely. The photograph showed Margaret walking out of a building Charlotte recognized immediately. Caldwell Capital's Midtown office tower. The timestamp was from 4 days ago. 2 days before Charlotte had told Margaret about Damian. 2 days before Charlotte had told Margaret about Harlan Voss. Charlotte looked at the photograph for a long time. The library was very quiet. "How long have you had this?" she said. "My people flagged it this morning." Damian's voice was careful. Not gentle, so careful, which was different. "I wanted to verify before I showed you." "And?" "She went in at 2:15 p.m. She was there for 40 minutes. She left alone." He paused. "It wasn't the first time. There's a record of 2 prior visits in the last 3 weeks, both during the period when you were sharing case information with her." Charlotte set the phone down on the desk. She did not move for a moment. She was running the timeline in her head with the cold, involuntary precision of a mind that processes pain by converting it immediately into information. The prenuptial document, the shell company analysis, the Harlan Voss profile, the Paris brothers file. Everything she had shared with Margaret, everything she had said in that apartment on the Upper East Side, believing she was in the only room where the truth was safe. The regulatory inquiry, she said, filed 9 days after your first meeting with Margaret. The investor withdrawal. Greyline Capital received its instruction 11 days after your second meeting. Charlotte picked up the phone again and looked at the photograph. Margaret's face in three-quarter profile, slightly blurred, caught mid-stride on a Manhattan sidewalk. 71 years old, her mother's friend, the woman who had asked Charlotte, quietly and without any apparent agenda, whether she was genuinely happy. She put the phone down. "Get out," she said. Damien didn't move. "Charlotte, I need 5 minutes." Her voice was completely flat. "Please." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and walked out of the library and pulled the door most of the way closed behind him, leaving a gap of a few inches, which she understood was not carelessness. Charlotte sat at the desk. She put both hands flat on the surface and looked at them. Margaret Holloway had known Charlotte's mother for 30 years, had been at the funeral, had held Charlotte's hand at the reception afterward when Charlotte was 22 and had not yet learned how to grieve in public without showing it, and had said nothing, just held her hand, which was the right thing and the thing Charlotte had never forgotten. She had trusted her completely. The word completely was the problem. Charlotte had trusted Margaret with everything, not because the evidence supported it specifically, but because the history supported it, because grief and loyalty and 30 years of proximity to her mother had felt like sufficient foundation. She had let the feeling of safety override the methodology she applied to everything else in her life. And Nathan had known she would, or Voss had known she would, or someone had known and had placed Margaret precisely where Charlotte's blind spot was. She breathed, once, twice. Then she picked up her phone and called Susan Cho. Susan answered on the second ring. "I need to know," Charlotte said, "what you've shared with Margaret in the last 3 weeks. Everything, in the order you shared it." A pause. "Charlotte, what's... Please, Susan, right now, Skem." Susan had shared the RICO framework analysis with Margaret 4 days ago, believing Margaret needed it for context on the legal strategy, which meant Nathan now knew the federal angle, which meant he knew that Charlotte was building toward DOJ involvement, which meant the timeline he had been operating on, the measured, escalating financial pressure, the messages, the careful demonstration of reach, had just been compressed. Charlotte explained this to Damien when she opened the library door and found him standing exactly where she expected him to be, in the hallway 3 feet from the door, not pretending he had been anywhere else. She told him in 6 sentences. He absorbed it in the silence that followed. "He'll move faster now," Damien said. "Yes?" "The ambush options, the ones I started to tell you about." He looked at her steadily. "I need to tell you all of it now." "Yes," Charlotte said. "You do." They went back into the library. What Damien told her took 20 minutes. He told her that Harlan Voss had a relationship with a private security contractor called Meridian Group, not a legitimate firm, or not only a legitimate firm, a hybrid operation that provided corporate security services as its public face and more specific services to clients who required outcomes that couldn't be achieved through legal means. He told her that Meridian had been used twice in the past 5 years in situations connected to Caldwell Capital. Once to manage a whistleblower who had threatened to go to the SEC, once to resolve a partnership dispute that had become inconvenient. He told her that in both cases, the resolution had been effective and permanent. Charlotte listened to this without changing her expression. "The whistleblower," she said, "recanted, completely and publicly, 18 months after the initial complaint. The SEC inquiry was dropped." Damien paused. "She now lives in Portland under a different name. My people found her. She won't speak on record." "And the partnership dispute?" "The partner withdrew from all business interests connected to Caldwell and relocated to Europe. His attorneys filed a statement attributing the withdrawal to health reasons." Another pause. "He was 39 and in excellent health at the time." The library was very quiet. Charlotte thought about the Paris brother who had died at 44. Heart attack. Meridian, she said. They've been contracted for this situation. I believe so, yes. When did you know? I suspected it 3 days ago. I confirmed it this morning. The same morning my people flagged the photograph of Margaret. He held her gaze. I was going to tell you both at the same time. I didn't expect the photograph to arrive first. Charlotte stood up from the desk. She walked to the window. Outside, the estate grounds were gray and still, and she could see, if she looked carefully, which she now did, the barely perceptible outline of one of Damien's people stationed near the tree line at the north perimeter, still as a post, watching the driveway. Margaret, she said without turning from the window, why would she do it? I don't know yet. Guess. A pause. Voss has been doing this for 20 years. He finds the people closest to a target, and he finds their pressure point, money, a secret, a threat aimed at someone they love. His voice was even. Whatever he found, it was enough. Charlotte looked at the man by the tree line. She thought about her mother's funeral, Margaret's hand around hers. She thought about Nathan's voice. She trusts me completely. That was the entire point. She turned from the window. I'm going to call her, Charlotte said. Damien's expression shifted slightly. Charlotte, not to confront her, to see where she is. She picked up her phone. If she's still pretending to be on my side, I want to know how she sounds doing it. And if she's going to warn Nathan that I know... She looked at Damien. I want to watch her make that choice. Damien was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. Charlotte dialed. Margaret answered on the third ring, and her voice was exactly what it had always been. Warm, alert. The voice of a woman who had spent 40 years being reliably present for difficult phone calls. Charlotte, I was going to call you this morning. Were you? Charlotte's voice was light, conversational. How are you, Margaret? Tired. This case is moving fast. A pause. I spoke with Susan last night. The federal angle concerns me. I think we may be moving too aggressively. Charlotte closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. There it was. Not too aggressively toward Nathan. Too aggressively toward federal jurisdiction. Margaret was trying to slow the case down. She had been slowing it down. The concerns she'd raised in their last 2 meetings about evidentiary standards, about the risks of involving federal prosecutors too early, about the importance of being certain before escalating. Charlotte had taken them as caution. They were something else. I'll think about what you've said, Charlotte said. Good. Charlotte, I just want to make sure we're protecting you first. Everything else is secondary. I know. Thank you, Margaret. She ended the call. She put the phone face down on the desk and stood with her hand on it and did not move for a moment. Then she said to no one in particular, in a voice that was very quiet and entirely without emotion, she's going to call him within the hour. Damien was already on his own phone. Samen. They pulled the recording at 9 that night. Charlotte did not ask how Damien's people had obtained it. She had stopped asking how by that point. She sat at the library desk and listened through a single earpiece while Damien stood at the window with his arms folded and his face in profile, watching the dark outside. Margaret's voice. Then a man's voice. Not Nathan. Voss. The smooth, careful cadence from the corridor, the voice Charlotte had heard only once and had apparently memorized without deciding to. Margaret. She knows about Meridian. Voss. How much? Margaret. Enough. She has a source who confirmed the contractor relationship. She knows about the whistleblower case. A pause. Voss. Does she know about the estate plan? Margaret. I don't think so. She hasn't mentioned it. Voss. Make sure. I need to know before Thursday. Margaret. This is getting out of hand, Harlan. We agreed there would be no... Voss. We agreed on an outcome. The method is my concern. You've been very well compensated for keeping your concern to a minimum, Margaret. I suggest you continue doing that. A long silence. Margaret. What happens Thursday? Voss. What needs to happen? The recording ended. Charlotte took the earpiece out. She set it on the desk. Thursday was 2 days away. She looked at Damien. The estate plan, she said. He asked if I knew about it. I don't. No. Damien turned from the window. His face was controlled, but not entirely. There was something working underneath the surface of it. Not anger exactly, but the thing that lives adjacent to anger in people who have learned not to let them touch each other. The estate plan is what I've been trying to confirm since yesterday. My people found a reference to it in Voss's communications 3 days ago. We don't have the full picture yet. What do you have? He was quiet for a moment. Charlotte. His voice was very level. I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is incomplete information. It may be wrong in its specifics. Tell me. The estate plan appears to be a contingency for a scenario in which the asset transfer through marriage becomes impossible, in which case the assets would need to transfer through a different mechanism. He paused. The mechanism Voss's communications reference is an inheritance structure. The room was absolutely still. Charlotte looked at him. My father, she said. Damien didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. Richard Whitmore is 67 years old and healthy, Charlotte said. Her voice was steady. She was making it stay steady. He has no known health conditions. His last physical was 3 months ago. I know. Nathan has access to my father. He has had access to him for 18 months. My father approved of him. They have had meals together, meetings together. They have been in the same rooms. Charlotte. Nathan cannot inherit from my father unless... She stopped. Unless Charlotte herself was no longer the primary heir, unless Charlotte was no longer in a position to inherit. The sentence completed itself inside her head with the specific, terrible clarity of a thing that has been true for a while and has only now been looked at directly. She stood up. The chair scraped back hard against the floor. She walked to the window and stood with her back to the room, both hands on the windowsill, looking at the dark estate grounds. And she did not speak for a long time. Damien did not speak either. Outside, his man was still at the tree line, still as a post. When Charlotte turned around, her face had undergone a change that Damien registered without commenting on, a hardening that was not coldness exactly, but was the specific expression of a person who has just arrived at the place where fear and fury compress into something else entirely, something operational. Thursday, she said. Yes. 2 days. Yes. She looked at him. I need to move my father, tonight. Somewhere Nathan's people can't reach him and Voss can't plan around. She paused. Can you do that without involving anyone who might have been turned? Yes. I also need to burn Margaret. Her voice did not waver. She goes to Susan tonight with a confession, or she goes to federal authorities with everything she knows about Voss. Those are her options. I want Susan in the room when it happens. And Nathan? Charlotte looked in the window. She thought about the $40,000 dress, the amber light of the ballroom chandeliers, Nathan's arm around her waist and the warm, complete laugh, and the 18 months of patient architectural deception aimed at a woman he had decided was not built for this. She thought about the Paris brother, 44 years old, heart attack. She thought about what Thursday meant, what it had been aimed at, what the options were that Nathan had mentioned in the corridor with the casual confidence of a man describing contingencies for a business problem rather than the end of a human life. She was not afraid. She was something colder than afraid, and cleaner, and she understood now what it had taken to get here. The 2 weeks of documents and legal briefs and careful patient case building, the trust she had extended and watched be weaponized, the photograph of her gate in the dark. All of it had been necessary. All of it had been the process by which she arrived at this moment. And this moment was the one where the woman Nathan Caldwell had decided was not built for difficult stopped building a case and started building something else. Nathan, she said, still looking at the window. Nathan is going to make his move Thursday because he thinks he still controls the timeline. She turned back to Damien. I want him to believe that until Wednesday night. I want him calm. I want him certain. She held Damien's gaze. And then I want everything he's built to come apart at the same time. Damien looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, because she suspected Charlotte Whitmore had stopped surprising him somewhere in the past week, but something adjacent to it, a recognition. That's a different kind of operation than what you've been building, he said. I know. It requires resources you don't have. I know that too. She held his eyes. But you do. The silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees at the north perimeter, and Damien's man at the tree line shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, and the estate settled into the particular quiet of a place bracing for. Wednesday came in cold and hard, the kind of November night that made the Connecticut countryside feel like the edge of something rather than the middle of it. Damien's people moved Richard Whitmore at 11 p.m. Tuesday. Charlotte had called her father herself. She had kept her voice steady and her explanation precise, and she had given him exactly enough information to understand that his life was in immediate danger, and exactly enough to trust that she had a plan. And Richard Whitmore, who had spent 40 years making decisions in the compressed space between incomplete information and irreversible consequences, had asked 2 questions, received 2 answers, and said, "Tell me where to go." He was in a safe house in western Massachusetts by 2 a.m., 3 of Damien's men on the perimeter, no phones connected to any network Nathan's people had ever touched. Charlotte had not slept. She was at the library desk at 7 a.m. Wednesday, with coffee going cold beside her when Damien came through the door and said, "Margaret broke last night." Charlotte looked up. Susan was with her for 4 hours. He sat down across from her. She gave everything. Voss approached her 8 months ago. He had documentation of a financial arrangement Margaret made 10 years ago that would have ended her career and potentially her freedom. He didn't threaten her directly. He simply made it clear he was aware of it and then asked for a small favor. The favors expanded over time. What was Thursday? Damien's jaw set slightly. Meridian was contracted to intercept your convoy. You had a meeting scheduled in the city, the follow-up with David Park. Charlotte's hands were flat on the desk. She did not move them. Intercept meaning. Meaning make it appear to be a road incident. Meaning ensure you did not arrive. The word arrive sat in the air between them. Charlotte looked at her hands. She had scheduled that meeting 4 days ago. She had mentioned it to Margaret in passing. Margaret had fed it directly to Voss, and Voss had fed it to Meridian, and by Thursday morning, a team of contracted men would have been positioned on the route between the Whitmore estate and Manhattan, waiting for a convoy that they had been paid to stop permanently. "The meeting is still on the books," Charlotte said. "Yes." She looked up at Damien. He was already watching her. "We're going to let them think it's still happening," she said. "That's what I want to do." His voice was careful. "But I need you to understand what that means. We use the convoy as a decoy. My people run a counter-operation against Meridian's team while they're in position. Simultaneously, Susan's federal contacts execute on the Voss documentation Margaret provided, and we take Nathan in the window before he gets word that the operation failed." "How long is the window?" 20 minutes, maybe less." Charlotte looked at the cold coffee beside her, at the documents on the desk, at 3 weeks of evidence assembled with the kind of patience that had kept her operational when everything inside her wanted to move faster than was safe. 20 minutes. "All right," she said. They spent Wednesday like people who are trying not to think about Thursday. Charlotte worked. She reviewed Susan's federal brief for the 4th time, marking 3 sections that needed strengthening. She called David Park and confirmed the meeting, real confirmation, using her regular phone, the one that Nathan's people had access to, and kept her voice entirely normal. She walked the estate grounds in the afternoon with James beside her and did not look at the tree line where Damien's perimeter team had tripled since Tuesday night. At 6 p.m., Nathan called. She answered, "Charlotte." His voice was warm, still working the warmth, still maintaining the performance for an audience of 1. "I've been thinking about us, about what went wrong." She sat in the library and watched the evening light die on the grounds outside. "Have you? I think I pushed too hard, with the wedding, the timeline. I think you felt overwhelmed, and I didn't pay enough attention to that." A pause. "I want to fix this, whatever it takes." She thought about Thursday morning, Meridian's team on a Connecticut highway. The word intercept. "I hear you, Nathan," she said. "Can we meet? After your meeting tomorrow. Dinner, somewhere quiet? Let me see how the day goes." "Of course." Another pause, and something in the quality of it shifted. Almost imperceptible, the pause of a man checking something off rather than waiting for something. "Drive safe tomorrow. The roads up there can be rough in November." Charlotte's hand tightened on the phone. 1 degree. No more. "I will," she said. "Good night, Nathan." She set the phone down. She sat for a long time in the growing dark. Then she got up, went to the kitchen, and ate something. She couldn't have said what, because Damien had told her 3 times in the past 2 days that she needed to eat, and she had ignored him twice and decided the 3rd time was a reasonable compromise. She stood at the kitchen counter and ate and looked at the dark window above the sink and thought about 20 minutes and what could go wrong inside them. Damien found her there. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her for a moment without speaking. "He told me to drive safe," Charlotte said. "I know. James pulled the call." She set the plate down. "He's certain." "Yes." Damien came into the kitchen. He stood on the other side of the counter, close enough that she was aware of the specific physical fact of him. The contained solidity of a man who had spent years in situations where the body's instincts are the last reliable instrument. "Charlotte, tomorrow morning, you're not in the convoy." "I know." "You're here, in this building, with 4 of my people and James and his full team. You don't move until I call you." She looked at him. "And you?" His expression didn't change. "I'll be where I need to be." She understood this to mean he would be in the counter-operation against Meridian, which meant he would be on a Connecticut highway in the cold before dawn with his people running a coordinated interception of a team of contracted men who had been paid to kill her. She looked at him and felt something she didn't examine closely because examining it required more time and more quiet than this particular Wednesday night contained. "Be careful," she said. It was inadequate. She knew it was inadequate. It was the only thing available. Something moved in Damien's face. Briefly, a crack in the controlled surface, there and then gone. "Get some sleep," he said. He left the kitchen. Charlotte stood at the counter for a long time. Then she went upstairs, lay down on the bed fully dressed, and closed her eyes. She woke to the sound of an explosion. It was 4:47 a.m., and the sound hit the estate like a physical force. Not a crack, not a bang, but a deep concussive pressure that Charlotte felt in her sternum before she was fully conscious, and she was off the bed and at the window before she understood she was moving. The north perimeter was on fire, not the tree line. Closer. The gatehouse at the north entrance was burning, a column of orange light punching up into the black sky, and Charlotte watched it for exactly 1 second before James was through her bedroom door with his weapon drawn and 2 of Damien's men behind him. "They're on the grounds," James said. His voice was stripped of everything except information. "Multiple points of entry. North gate is compromised. We have contact at the east perimeter." Charlotte's mind arrived fully in the moment with the specific, total clarity that she would later understand as the body's emergency resource. Fear converted instantly into function. "Damien," she said, "en route. He got word 12 minutes ago that the convoy operation was a secondary element." James took her arm, not roughly, but with the absolute grip of a man who has been given one job. "Ms. Whitmore, we need to move. Now." They moved. The estate's interior was a different world from the burning north perimeter. Lit, quiet, the sound of gunfire outside arriving muffled through the walls, and this unreality of it. The chandeliers still on in the hallway, the carpet soft underfoot, made the whole thing feel briefly like a dream before another explosion, closer this time, somewhere on the east side, drove the feeling out completely. James took her down through the kitchen to the basement level. 2 of his team were already positioned at the basement entrance, and Damien's 2 men held the rear. Charlotte counted faces automatically, 6 plus James plus herself. The comms unit on James's shoulder crackled, a voice she didn't recognize. "East wall's holding. We have 3 down on their side. They're pushing toward the main structure." James: "Copy. Hold the east wall. Do not let them reach the building." Another voice: "North team is pulling back. They lost the gatehouse. They're reorganizing." Charlotte stood in the basement corridor and listened to the sound of her family's estate being assaulted by men who had been paid to ensure she did not survive the night. And she breathed, deliberately, slowly, counting the way she always counted. And she thought with absolute cold clarity about what Nathan Caldwell had said on the phone 3 hours ago. Drive safe. The basement had 1 external exit, a maintenance access point on the south side of the estate, furthest from the active perimeter breaches. James was already moving toward it. Charlotte followed. Her legs were steady. Her hands were steady. The part of her that was not steady was operating somewhere below the accessible level of her consciousness, and she left it there. The maintenance exit was a steel door at the end of a concrete corridor. One of Damien's men went through first, cleared the immediate area, came back in. South side is clean, vehicle is 30 meters. We move fast and low. They went through the door. The cold hit Charlotte like a wall. The raw Connecticut November, no coat, the fire from the north perimeter visible above the roofline as a burning orange glow against the black sky. The sound of gunfire was clearer outside, directional, coming from the east and north simultaneously. She ran. 30 meters across open ground felt like 30 miles. They reached the vehicle, a dark SUV, engine running, one of Damien's men behind the wheel, and Charlotte was in the back seat with James beside her, and the doors were closing and the vehicle was moving before she had fully registered being inside it. Then the rear window exploded. Charlotte dropped. James shoved her down across the seat, and she heard his weapon fire twice, deafening, the inside of the car full of the sound and the smell of it, and the SUV accelerated hard, fishtailing on the frozen grass before the tires found the service road. Glass in her hair, her left forearm burning where something had cut it. She didn't know what. A fragment of window. She cataloged it and left it. James? She pushed herself upright, blood on her arm, not serious. James, are you... I'm here. His voice was strained, different. She looked at him and saw the dark stain spreading on his left shoulder and understood that the strain in his voice was not adrenaline. You're hit. It's manageable. His weapon was still up, covering the rear window. Stay down. James! Stay down, Ms. Whitmore. She stayed down. The SUV was on the estate driveway now, moving fast toward the south gate, and Charlotte lay across the seat with glass in her hair and her forearm bleeding and James's blood on the seat beside her, and she listened to the comms traffic coming through the driver's unit. Fragmented, overlapping voices reporting contact and casualties in position. And she tried to build a picture of what was happening on the estate ground she could no longer see. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Damien. She answered. Where are you? His voice was tight. Not panicked. Damien's voice would not panic, but stripped of everything except immediate function. In the vehicle. South gate. James is hit. How bad? Shoulder. He's conscious. Get to the secondary location. Do not stop. I'm 20 minutes out. What's happening on the grounds? A beat. In that beat, she heard something. Distant, through the phone, the sound of gunfire on his end. Damien. Meridian fielded 2 teams. The convoy operation was a diversion. The estate was the primary target. His voice was absolutely even. They wanted you in the building, Charlotte. The convoy was to keep you here. She understood this in a single cold instant. They had seen through her decoy, or they had never relied on the convoy operation at all. The estate assault had been the plan. Come for her at home, in the night, where the perimeter was known and the exits were finite. Are your people handling it? Go. The call ended. The SUV cleared the south gate and hit the public road, and the driver accelerated hard into the darkness. And Charlotte pushed herself upright and pressed her hand against James's shoulder, the way she had been told to do approximately never in her professional life, and had apparently retained somewhere in the background of her mind. And James let out a short, controlled breath and said, I'm fine. In the voice of a man who is definitely not entirely fine, but has decided that fine is the operational position. Stop talking, she said. Ms. Whitmore. James. Stop talking and let me do this. He stopped talking. The driver was on the comms unit, reporting their position, and the road unspooled ahead of them in the headlights. Empty, dark, the Connecticut countryside on both sides without feature or light. And Charlotte held pressure on James's shoulder and breathed, and did not think about what she had left behind on the estate grounds, because thinking about it was not useful, and what was useful was exactly what she was doing. They drove for 19 minutes. The secondary location was a farmhouse 12 miles from the estate, owned through 3 layers of legal structure by an entity that had no traceable connection to anyone in this situation, which was how Damien operated. Charlotte had come to understand, in the same way that water runs downhill, not as a choice, but as a fundamental characteristic of how he moved through the world. She got James inside. One of Damien's men, already present at the farmhouse, which she had expected, was also apparently competent in field medicine, which she had not expected and was deeply grateful for. He had James's jacket off and the wound assessed in 4 minutes. Through and through, clean, significant blood loss, manageable without a surgical facility. James looked at the assessment with the expression of a man who had been hoping for this verdict and was relieved to receive it. "Told you," he said. "You told me nothing. You told me to stay down." Charlotte was standing against the far wall of the farmhouse kitchen with her arms crossed and her cut forearm wrapped in a dish towel and her pulse doing something she wished it would stop doing. "How many of your team are still on the grounds?" 6. He shifted, winced. "They can hold." Damien said 20 minutes. "Then we wait 20 minutes. She looked at her phone. No messages. The comms unit the driver carried was still running. Fragmented updates from the estate. The language of men managing a deteriorating situation with the specific vocabulary of people who have trained for exactly this. She heard Damien's name twice in the traffic. Both times the voice on the other end was calm, which she decided to interpret as a good sign and accept no alternative interpretation of until she had reason to. 14 minutes later, her phone buzzed. Not Damien's number. Nathan. She looked at the screen for the length of 2 full rings. Then she answered. "Charlotte." His voice was different. The warmth was gone. Not replaced by anything overt, just absent. The way a mask looks different when the person wearing it has stopped trying. "Where are you?" "Safe," she said. A pause. "I heard there was an incident at the estate." An incident. She looked at the dish towel around her arm, at James on the kitchen table with Damien's man working on his shoulder, at the glass she had shaken out of her hair 20 minutes ago into the farmhouse sink. "That's what we're calling it." "Charlotte." His voice was lower now, careful in a new way, the care of a man recalculating. "Whatever you think is happening, Nathan," she cut him off cleanly. "I know about Meridian. I know about Harlan Voss. I know about the estate plan and what Thursday was supposed to look like." She paused. "I know about the Paris brothers." Silence. The specific total silence of a man who has just understood that the architecture he has been building for 2 years has been fully seen. When he spoke again, his voice was very quiet. "You should have just married me. I know you believe that. This doesn't have to go further." "It's already gone further, Nathan. 20 people just assaulted my family's estate." Her voice was completely steady. "It went further the moment you looked at my father's company and decided it was something you were entitled to take." A long silence. "You can't prove any of it," he said. Margaret Holloway spent 4 hours last night with a former federal prosecutor providing a sworn statement about her contact with Harlan Voss. Susan Cho filed the preliminary federal brief at 6 a.m. this morning. Charlotte paused. "And Damien Rossi has been building a parallel evidentiary file for 3 weeks that I suspect is going to be considerably more comprehensive than anything your attorneys are prepared for." Another silence. Longer. She heard something in it. Not fear exactly, but the sound that exists just before fear, the moment of recalibration, when a man understands that the structure he has been standing on is not what he thought it was. "Charlotte." The farmhouse door opened. Damien walked in. He was in dark clothing, and there was blood on his left hand that she did not think was his, and his face carried the specific expression of a man who has just come through something and has not yet had time to process what it cost. He looked across the kitchen at her. His eyes moved to the dish towel on her arm, back to her face. She held up one finger, one moment, and said into the phone, "Turn yourself in, Nathan. Tonight. Whatever your attorneys tell you about your options at this point, I promise you that the option of running is worse than the option of surrender. Because the people who are currently dismantling everything you've built are not going to stop. And the federal case that Susan filed this morning is going to be fully supported by evidence you have no idea exists." She paused one final time. "You told your associate I wasn't built for this. I need you to understand something. You were—" She never finished the sentence. The phone went dead in her hand. Nathan had ended the call, or the connection had dropped, or he had thrown the phone across whatever room he was standing in. And Charlotte stood in the farmhouse kitchen with the device against her palm and the dish towel around her forearm, and Damien across the room watching her with blood on his left hand, and the specific expression of a man who has just walked out of something and is still determining what he walked out of. She put the phone in her pocket. "James needs a hospital," she said. "Car's outside." Damien didn't move yet. His eyes were still on her face, doing the inventory she had come to recognize. The silent, methodical check that was not about damage assessment, so much as about something she still didn't entirely have language for. "You're cut. It's not deep." "Charlotte." "It's not deep, Damien." She met his eyes. "How many of yours?" A pause. "2 injured, nothing critical." He looked at the dish towel. "We need to look at that. We need to get James to a hospital first, and then we need to—" "Charlotte." His voice was very quiet. "Stop." She stopped. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and took her arm, gently, with the particular gentleness of a man who has spent his life using his hands for things that require force, and has learned that the absence of force can be its own kind of precision, and unwrapped the dish towel and looked at the cut. 3 inches along the forearm, the glass from the SUV window, already clotting. He held her arm for a moment without speaking. She looked at the top of his head as he examined the wound, the dark hair, the set of his shoulders, the blood on his left hand that was not his, and she made herself not ask about it because the answer was something she would need time and quiet to absorb, and neither was available yet. "It needs stitches," he said. "Later." He looked up at her. She held his gaze. "James first, then stitches, then everything else." He rewrapped the arm, tighter. His hands were steady, which she registered because her own were not entirely, a tremor in the right one that she had been managing by keeping it pressed against her side and intended to continue managing that way until it resolved on its own. "All right," he said. James got his hospital at 3 a.m., a private facility 40 minutes from the farmhouse, the kind of place that operated with the particular discretion available to institutions that have spent years serving clients for whom discretion is not a preference but a requirement. Damien's people had called ahead. The shoulder wound was cleaned and closed, and James was installed in a room by 4:15 with the particular expression of a man who has survived something and is now being forced to lie still, which he found considerably more difficult than the surviving. Charlotte sat in the chair beside his bed until he told her to go get the stitches. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Ms. Whitmore." His voice was rough from the anesthetic working through his system. "I've been shot before." She looked at him. "I didn't know that. There are things about my history that aren't on my resume." A pause. "Go get the arm looked at. I'm not dying tonight." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had stood between her and every room she'd walked into for 4 years, who had driven her through 20 states and 100 cities and 1 burning Connecticut estate, who had taken a bullet on a dark road and told her to stay down. "James," she said. "Don't," he said. She understood what he meant. He was not a man who received that kind of thing easily, and she was not a person who offered it easily, and the moment balanced on that shared understanding. "I'll be back in the morning," she said. "I'll be exactly here." She left. Damien had her arm stitched by 5 a.m. in a room down the hall. A doctor who arrived with the same efficiency as everything else Damien arranged, quiet and competent, and asking no unnecessary questions. 7 stitches, local anesthetic. The needle was not pleasant, but Charlotte had discovered in the past 8 hours that her threshold for unpleasant had undergone a significant recalibration. Afterward, she sat in the corridor outside James's room, and Damien sat beside her, and for a long time neither of them said anything. The corridor was empty and white and very quiet. "Nathan didn't turn himself in," Charlotte said. "No." Damien was looking at the middle distance. "His attorneys contacted the federal prosecutors at 2 a.m. They're negotiating terms." "Negotiating?" She let the word sit. "He thinks he can still negotiate. He thinks a lot of things. Most of them are going to stop being true in the next 72 hours. Damien paused. Voss was taken into federal custody at midnight. He didn't negotiate. His attorneys are still trying to understand the scope of the documentation Susan's people have. Charlotte thought about Voss's voice on the recording. Smooth and careful. The particular smoothness of a man who had spent 20 years ensuring consequences landed elsewhere. "The Paris family," she said. Daniel Paris has been contacted. He'll give a full deposition. A pause. The evidence connecting Voss to the fabricated regulatory complaint against his brother's company is in federal hands as of 6 hours ago. Charlotte looked at her arm, the clean white bandage over the stitches. His brother died? Yes. Nathan and Voss destroyed a company, and one of the men who built it died. And for 6 years, nobody with resources enough to do anything about it was willing to. She paused. And then I canceled a wedding. Damien looked at her. She wasn't sure what she meant exactly. The sentence had arrived from somewhere below the level she was deliberately operating at, from the part of her that had been running since the corridor of the Ashford Grand Hotel and had not been given permission to stop yet. The strange arithmetic of it. The chain of events that had begun with a $40,000 dress and ended here, in a hospital corridor in November with stitches in her arm, and her family's estate still smoking in the dark somewhere behind her. You should sleep, Damien said. I know. Charlotte, I know. She leaned her head back against the wall. Tell me the estate is secure. My people have the perimeter. Local law enforcement arrived at 4 a.m. The federal team will be on site by morning. He paused. The estate is secure. She closed her eyes. She sat in the hospital corridor with her head against the wall and her arms stitched and her heart doing something that was not quite normal yet, but was at least consistent, and she let the silence of the building settle around her, and she stayed there until sleep arrived, which it did, eventually, in the thin and graceless way that sleep arrives when it is long overdue and the body simply stops asking permission. Damien did not leave. Nathan Caldwell was arrested on a Friday morning 10 days later. He did not negotiate successfully. The federal case, when Susan Cho and her team fully assembled it, was the kind of document that has no comfortable center, a comprehensive architecture of fraud, conspiracy, and deliberate harm that stretched back 6 years and touched 43 individuals and 11 companies across 4 states. The fabricated regulatory complaints, the shell company network, the Meridian Group contracts, the asset transfer scheme, the estate assault, which federal prosecutors charged as attempted murder. Charlotte was not in the room when the arrest happened. She was at the Whitmore estate, which had taken 2 weeks to repair and would take longer to feel entirely like itself again. There was a section of the east wall that still showed the marks of what had happened, a scorched line along the stone that the contractor had offered to remove completely and that Charlotte had told him to leave. She wanted to be able to look at it. She was standing at the library window, her particular window, the one she had stood at 100 times in the past month watching the grounds change in the November light, when Margaret called her. She looked at the number for a long moment. Then she answered. Charlotte. Margaret's voice was the voice of a woman who has spent 2 months carrying something heavy and has recently set it down and is still feeling the weight of where it was. I wanted to hear your voice. Charlotte said nothing. I know that's not something I've earned. Margaret paused. I'm not calling to ask for forgiveness. I'm calling because I needed to. I needed to tell you that everything I told the prosecutors was true and complete. There's nothing I held back. Whatever happens to me legally, I want you to know that. Charlotte looked at the scorched line on the east wall, visible from the library window at an angle. She had not spoken to Margaret since the night she called her from the farmhouse to say that the federal case was in motion and that Margaret's name was in the documentation and that she should call her own attorney. Why did you answer when I called you? Charlotte said. The night I found out. If you were already reporting to Voss, why did you answer? A long pause. Because I hoped I was wrong about what he was planning, Margaret said. I told myself it was just financial manipulation, that it wouldn't go further than that. Her voice was very quiet. I was wrong about what he was planning, and I was wrong to think I could manage the line between what I was doing and what I believed I would never do. Those things were always connected. I didn't let myself see it. Charlotte breathed. You knew my mother for 30 years, she said. Yes. She trusted you. Yes. Margaret's voice broke on the word cleanly, like something that had been waiting to break for a long time. She did. And I think about that every day. Charlotte stood at the window. She thought about the night in the hospital corridor when she had sat against the wall and let sleep take her, and she thought about the arithmetic of it. the chain of decisions and betrayals and consequences that had moved through her life like a current in the past 2 months. And she thought about what it meant to hold someone accountable without letting accountability become the whole story. She didn't have an answer to that yet. She wasn't certain she was supposed to. "Margaret," she said, "cooperate with the prosecutors completely. Every question, every document, every conversation you remember. Don't hold anything back because you think it might make things worse for you. It won't." She paused. "And when this is over, don't call me again." She ended the call. She put the phone in her pocket and stood at the window for a long time. The trial took 4 months. Charlotte testified on the 3rd day. She walked into the courtroom in a gray suit with her hair down and took the oath and sat in the witness chair and looked at Nathan Caldwell across the room. He was in a dark suit. His attorneys had dressed him carefully, and he was still, at the surface, the man she had met 18 months ago. The same jaw, the same posture, the same face that had been designed by time and practice to communicate trustworthiness. He looked at her. She looked back. She answered the prosecutor's questions for 4 hours in the same voice she used in boardrooms. Clear, precise, entirely without performance. She walked the jury through the corridor at the Ashford Grand and what she had heard there. She walked them through the shell companies and the amended prenuptial and the Voss connection and the Meridian contract. She described the estate assault in the same register, the same precision, and she watched the jury's faces as she described James in the vehicle with blood spreading on his shoulder, telling her he was fine. When Nathan's attorney cross-examined her, he tried 3 different approaches over 90 minutes. She dismantled each one, not aggressively, simply accurately, with the patience of a person who knows what the truth is and is not threatened by questions about it. Nathan did not testify. The verdict came on a Thursday. Guilty on all counts. Charlotte was sitting in the 2nd row when the foreman read it, and she heard it and felt it land in the part of her that had been holding something since the corridor at the Ashford Grand. Some suspended question about whether what she had heard that night was the beginning of something that would resolve or something that would simply continue. She felt it land and she felt it settle, and she did not cry and she did not make a sound, but she pressed her hand flat against her leg under the table and held it there until the courtroom's noise rose around her. Across the room, Nathan sat very still. He looked at her once, in the moment after the foreman finished speaking. She held his gaze. She held it until he looked away. Potent. Spring came to the Whitmore estate the way it always came. Quietly, without announcement, the grounds going green in the specific way of a place that has been cared for long enough to know how to recover. Charlotte walked the grounds on a Saturday morning in April, with her coffee and her coat, and the particular unhurried quality she had slowly, over the course of the winter, been teaching herself to inhabit. She had spent 28 years moving at the velocity of someone who believed that stillness was a form of falling behind, and she had spent the past 4 months in the slow, effortful process of understanding that this had not been entirely true. The east wall had been repaired in February. The scorched line was gone. She had decided, eventually, that this was also right. Her father found her near the garden wall at the south end of the grounds. Richard Whitmore, at 67, moved with the slightly deliberate quality of a man who has recently been frightened and has responded to the experience by paying closer attention to his body than he previously did. He had not spoken much about the months he'd spent in the Massachusetts safe house while the case was being built. He was not a man who spoke much about what things cost him, but he had called Charlotte every morning since she'd brought him home. Every morning. Without fail, usually before 7. He stood beside her at the garden wall and looked at the spring grounds and said nothing for a while. "The board approved the restructure," he said finally. "I know, Susan sent the filing. 3 new independent directors, the conflict of interest provisions we talked about." He paused. "It's a good structure." "It's a better structure," Charlotte said, "than what we had." He was quiet again. Then, "I approved of him." "Dad, I approved of him," Richard said again, not loudly, not with accusation, but with the specific flatness of a man forcing himself to say a true thing all the way through. "He was in my company for 18 months because I thought he was good enough for my daughter, and what he actually was, what he was the entire time, I never saw it." Charlotte looked to the spring grounds. "Neither did I," she said, "for a long time." "You saw it?" I heard it accidentally in a corridor at a party. She paused. That's not the same as seeing. You saw it, her father said again, and then you did something about it. Alone. Before you told me, before you told anyone. You found a way. He was looking at her now, and his face had the expression she had seen perhaps 4 times in her life, the expression Richard Whitmore produced when he had run out of the particular armor he used for everything else. Your mother would have been, Dad. She kept her voice gentle. He stopped. They stood at the garden wall in the April morning. After a while, he put his hand briefly on her shoulder, his version of the thing he couldn't say. And then he turned and walked back toward the estate, and Charlotte stood and watched him go and felt something that was not grief and not happiness, but the particular texture of love as it actually exists in the world. Complicated, imperfect, made of what survives. Damien came that afternoon. He had been doing that, coming to the estate on Saturday afternoons with the easy, unpressured quality of a man who has decided that presence is the appropriate language for what he means and is patient enough to let it speak over time. They usually walked. Sometimes they worked. Charlotte at the library desk, Damien with his own devices at the other end of the table, the two of them occupying the same silence with the comfort of people who have been through something together that changes the geometry of a room. Today they walked. The south grounds. The garden, down to the edge of the property where the land dropped toward the tree line and the afternoon light came horizontal through the bare-branched trees. Voss got 12 years, Damien said. I heard. She had gotten the notification from Susan that morning. His attorneys will appeal. They won't get far. No. She paused. Daniel Paris called me yesterday. Damien looked at her. He wanted to thank me. She kept her eyes on the tree line. I didn't know what to say to that. His brother has been dead for 2 years, and Voss is going to spend 12 years in a minimum security facility, and probably 8, and the company they built is gone, and it was never coming back regardless of the verdict. She paused. He thanked me anyway. What did you say? I said I was sorry it took this long. She paused. He said that's what he needed to hear. They walked in silence for a while. The estate grounds were long enough that you could walk for 20 minutes without reaching the same place twice, which Charlotte had always loved about the property. The sense of space that was not limitless but was sufficient. Room enough to think, room enough to breathe. The Meridian Group, she said. The principals. Federal prosecution is ongoing. 2 of them have already taken plea agreements. A pause. The man who gave the order for the estate operation won't. Will they get him? Eventually. Damien's voice was quiet but absolute. Yes. She nodded. She thought about James, who was back at work and had refused to take the additional medical leave Charlotte had offered him with the particular stubbornness of a man who regards recovery as an insult to his professional identity. She thought about the 2 of Damien's people who had been injured on the estate grounds. Both recovered, both back to wherever they had come from, lives she would never know in any detail. She thought about the cost of things. The actual cost, not the financial kind. Damien. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. She turned and looked at him, directly, the way he had always looked at her, without the management of expression that she applied to most of her interactions with the world. The afternoon light was behind him, and he was watching her with the particular attention she had spent 4 months gradually coming to understand was not professional assessment, but something that required more courage to look at. Why did you come to the estate that night? She said. The first night, you saw a news story about a canceled wedding and you got in your car. He held her gaze. I told you I knew something was wrong. How? Because I knew you, from a long time ago. He paused, and because the version of you that would cancel a wedding 6 weeks out without a public statement was a version of you that was in trouble. And He stopped. She waited. I had thought about you, he said, more than made sense for someone I knew briefly in a different part of my life. And when I saw your face on that news alert, I understood that if I didn't go and you needed help, I would spend the rest of my life in the specific kind of company that I was not willing to keep. Charlotte looked at him. She thought about the first night, the library. Who hurt you? The simplest and most devastating question. She thought about this corridor at the Ashford Grand and the woman who had stood in it. The woman in the $40,000 dress who had believed, with the particular confidence of someone who has always been the most capable person in every room, that she understood the architecture of her own life. And she thought about who she was now, standing at the edge of her family's property in the April afternoon, stitches long since dissolved, the trial done, the verdict in, the empire intact. Not the same woman, not better, exactly. The word better implied a simplicity that the past 4 months had comprehensively dismantled, but different in a way that felt irreversible, and on the better days felt like something she had moved toward rather than something that had been done to her. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right. I don't make decisions like this easily, personal ones. I'm better at the other kind." She paused. "I analyze things past the point where analysis is useful, and I trust evidence over instinct, and I have spent 8 years being the person who is most prepared in every room, which means I have also spent 8 years being the person who is most offended." She paused again. "You walked through my gate and asked me one question, and I told you everything. I have never done that. I don't know what that means about you specifically, or about whatever this is, but I think it means something." Damien looked at her for a long moment. "I think it means," he said quietly, "that you were ready to." The afternoon settled around them. The tree line, the horizontal light, the spring grounds of a place that had been through fire and assault and the long winter of legal process and had come out the other side still standing, which was not a small thing. Charlotte looked at Damien Rossi, this man from a world she had spent her life adjacent to without ever entering. This man who had taught her that the most dangerous person in a room is not always the one with the most weapons, that loyalty is not the same as safety, and that the question of who is worthy of trust is the most consequential question a person can answer. And she made a decision with the same finality she brought to decisions that could not be undone. She reached out and took his hand. He looked down at their hands. Then he looked up at her. And for the first time in longer than she could precisely calculate, Charlotte Whitmore smiled with nothing behind it except exactly what it was. 1 year later, on a Saturday afternoon in April, the Whitmore estate held a private ceremony. No press, no photographers, no socialites or senators or Forbes correspondents, no $40,000 dress and no ballroom chandeliers, and no 500 people performing their attendance. 40 people in the garden by the south wall where the spring light came in level and gold through the trees. Richard Whitmore in the front row, straight-backed and silver-haired, his face doing the thing it only did 4 or 5 times in his life. James in the second row with his wife, his left shoulder moved with only the faintest trace of the injury that had healed clean through the winter, as he had assured everyone it would. Charlotte walked through the garden in a dress that had cost her no anxiety whatsoever, because she had bought it herself in an hour on a Tuesday morning, and it was the right dress because it was hers in the simple and complete sense. She walked toward Damien, who was waiting at the end of the garden path, with the expression of a man who has spent his life being the most watchful person in every room and has found the one place where he is willing to put that down. She reached him. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, directly, completely, without the management or the performance that she had spent her whole life navigating in the people around her. She had almost married a man who saw her inheritance when he looked at her. She had almost become the property of a person who had confused acquisition with love, who had built 18 months of careful architecture aimed at a woman he had never once actually seen. Instead, she was here, in her family's garden, in April, marrying a man who had driven to her gate in the dark and asked, "Who hurt you?" and had meant it, and had stayed, and had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly what she was. They said their vows in the plain language of people who have run out of patience for performance. The afternoon held still around them, and when it was done, Charlotte Whitmore, who was not a woman who cried easily, who had stood in courtrooms and boardrooms and burning estates with the same controlled steadiness, who had learned very young that composure was a form of survival, felt something move through her chest that was not grief and not fear, and not the unnamed heaviness she had carried into a gala in Manhattan a year and a half ago. It was simpler than all of those things. It was the feeling of being known, completely, without management, without strategy, without the careful presentation she had been assembling since she was old enough to understand that her name and her face and her father's fortune made her simultaneously visible and invisible in the world. Just known. She held Damien's hands in the April garden, and she looked at him and she let herself be seen. And for the first time since the night in the corridor, the night she had stood in the cold with her hand on the wallpaper and felt her life collapse into silence, Charlotte Whitmore knew exactly where she was. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.